evening, everybody. Bonsoir, bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Merci encore une fois de vous présenter en tellement grand nombre. Ça nous fait tellement plaisir à notre soirée MedTech, BML Santé, toujours avec nos partenaires CTS Santé qui sont ici. Il y a aussi Jean-Pierre Robert cette fois avec nous. On est très content de accueillir JP. Toujours avec Startup en résidence. Où êtes-vous? Vous êtes représentés, on vous voit. And also, of course, our sponsors, BDO. Hey, Matt. Hey, Rich. Thank you, everybody. We're so happy to be back and have our event series back online. We assemble colleagues, friends, industry stakeholders around a common goal, medtech innovation, and discussing impact on healthcare. We always look to add value to our ecosystem and beyond. These things are recorded and they're shared. Presenting topics for discussion. We like to ask difficult questions. We don't always answer them, but it leads to exciting conversation. Cette fois, nous nous trouvons au pavillon de la Jamaïque, du grand événement Expo 67 sur le circuit Gilles Villeneuve de l'Île Notre-Dame, le circuit lui-même. In this historic building from Expo 67, the event that invited the world to Montreal 60 years ago for the World's Fair and later lent its name to the Montreal Expos, you might notice. Expo 67, which we feel are part of the glory days of Montreal, and some of us actually remember Expo 67. Montreal was the center of culture and tourism at the time, hosting the World's Fair, the international chefs who stayed in Montreal and actually developed what is now the Montreal food scene and what it's become. A lot of people attribute that to the Expo 67 event. And Jean Drapeau, we're on Parc Jean Drapeau, Buckminster Fuller's Geodesic Dome, and Moïse Sadfi's Bâtiment 67, all part of this wonderful history that we're making a small nod to tonight. A few years later, not too many years later, Montreal would host the Olympics. Gilles Villeneuve would race for Ferrari literally right outside these windows. Our Prime Minister's wife was hanging out with the Rolling Stones. Who knew that her son would turn out to be more like her than his father? Montreal was the political, business, and cultural heart of Canada. Now fast forward 60 years and perhaps history repeats itself. In Montreal, we find ourselves in the middle of an amazing time in medtech innovation. Investment in medtech has never been higher. Recovering from post-pandemic drops that we kind of can understand. And technology is at an inflection point, and we see it very well represented here tonight in our small but vibrant and strong ecosystem. CTS Santé is here, Startup en Résidence, Banque Desjardins, Centech, one of the biggest accelerator programs in the world. Merck Digital Science Studio is represented. McGill Dobson is here. Concordia D3. Mila, who's attracting AI talent to Montreal from all over the world. McGill and the MUHC, l'Université de Montréal et le CHUM, Investissement Québec et le gouvernement du Canada représenté par le Service fédéral des délégués commerciaux. Not a bad lineup for a small room in Montreal. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Of course, I mentioned BDO, our sponsors. We couldn't do this without you, Matt and Rich. We appreciate it. Not for nothing, it's in the middle of tax season, and we do realize that you're making an effort to be here. We appreciate it very much. Why don't we say hi, Matt and Richard? Thank you very, very, very much, gentlemen. Nous avons le grand plaisir ce soir d'avoir parmi nous un grand des grands dans le monde de MedTech. You may or may not know our guest, but I first met Joel during the pandemic, working on the Code Life ventilator project with the Montreal General Hospital. In all honesty, he seemed to be the only one in Canada who knew anything about ventilators. And it sounds like a joke, but I think it was true at the time. We were supposed to be competitors. We are on paper, but we quickly became friends, colleagues, and collaborators. Joel is a medtech executive, an entrepreneur, a strategic advisor, specializing in taking medical devices from concept to commercialization, senior leadership roles in conceptual development, pivotal trials, and of course, regulatory approval. the founder of Ironstone Product Development, that we affectionately call Ironstone PD. You may or may not have heard of it. At the time, it became Canada's leading medtech advisory until it was acquired by Avania in 2023, only 2.5 years ago. Joel has certainly left his mark on our industry in Canada, but also in the US and all over the world, helping bring so many innovative technologies, not just to market, but in real clinical applications all over the world, in critical care, in neurology, in robotics, in diagnostics, imaging, and digital health. The products Joel has worked on have collectively generated over $1 billion in revenue worldwide. It's not about the dollar amount for me, it's about the impact, obviously.
Yeah, and as a consultant, I got like none of that.
None of that. S'il vous plaît, aidez-moi tout le monde à accueillir. Please help me in welcoming my friend and our very, very special guest for the evening, Joel Ironstone, everybody. So Joel chose the title and the theme of our evening, Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Is that it? Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose? And Joel asked that I keep it in French, even on the English marketing, and that drove Johan crazy, but I thought it was really great, so we did that. And what does that mean to us in MedTech, Joel?
Yeah, well, I'm always reading these articles where we've been saying, look, everything's changed. There's this new FDA guidance document. There's a new technology. You got to reset everything you're doing. And I'm always wondering, what's really changed here? And I thought back, if I started my career, let's say 1999, 2000, and I went in a time machine and I came to now, I think I could do my job just as well. Like the principles are identical, the things that matter are identical, the details have maybe changed a bit, but I felt that we focused too much on these like high-level process-oriented things, not enough on like the core stuff, which really has remained the same for me.
New challenges, but same approaches, in other words.
Yeah, honestly, like we could say new challenges, it's still the same challenge. We're still trying to make people's lives better, reduce mortality, reduce morbidity. We're trying to collect the evidence to show that. All that is really consistent to me, across the years. And maybe the names of things have changed, like some of the titles of the reports you might generate, but like the core of what we're doing has really always been the same, even well before like MedTech was regulated.
Yeah, back in the 60s.
Back in the 60s, so there were medical devices during Expo, and I'm sure they were thinking about the same things critically.
Yeah. Joel, I mentioned who was here in the room. We also have several dozen startup founders, believe it or not. As I mentioned, all the accelerators and the programs that we call, MedTech stakeholders. We know that the lion's share of innovation right now is being done by startups. And something I love, you told me, everything you learned about MedTech, you learned in your first failed startup.
Yeah, this was a company called ZTech. I don't know if anyone remembers back in, I guess, the early 2000s, there were these labor-sponsored funds. So you got a massive tax credit if you invested in a VC fund. And that VC fund was obligated to deploy capital in Canada to like high technology startups. And as a result, since there weren't that many high technology startups available, some of them got tons of cash. I would say too much cash. And that cash wasn't paired with insight experience. We're really learning in Canada how to develop, commercialize medical technology. So I was hired to this company. I was the first hire to this company was attempting to replace mammography for breast cancer screening with electrical impedance technology. And look, that market is it's one of the most commonly done imaging procedures. The market was massive. So these investors love that massive market. But what happened there and the failures that both the founder, I wasn't the technical founder, I sort of first engineer, the mistakes that we made, I see repeated daily, weekly. I'll give you a few examples. The device was intended to detect breast cancer, so one would hope that it detected breast cancer, right? And if it's going to replace mammography, it has to be better than mammography. And what happened was, and I see this with AI companies, they had an algorithm and they sort of kind of contorted the algorithm and pulled patients out and pushed patients in until they got a great diagnostic accuracy. And then they showed that to the VCs, and the VCs never really questioned that. They're like, great, fantastic, we're going to replace mammography, here's your $30 million, go. And not only that, but they hired a team that had never done this before. They had never taken a medical device to market before. They had never done a class 3 PMA device. They didn't understand like the risks with commercialization. And so as this sort of junior guy working through, I had to figure out everything from scratch. So we wrote our quality system from scratch, like by looking at the standards and then writing the procedures. We submitted our CE mark. We had never seen another CE mark technical file. We did it on our own. We designed a clinical trial, negotiated with FDA. Maybe we had a little bit of advice there. But we kept, so this is a really expensive, I would say, PhD for me. And one of the things, my model as I was going forward, was to prevent other companies from spending $30 million to get to this place, and frankly, a failure. So eventually this company went bankrupt in 2008. And probably in 2002, we could have figured out that this, sort of trajectory was hopeless if only we had done this before, had someone get on there before. So the other part that I learned that I see a lot with early stage companies, and this happened to me, is I loved being, the head of engineering, the head of regulatory for this early stage startup. I loved when people asked me, what did you do? And I said, I'm running the engineering department for this company that's going to replace mammography for breast cancer screening. It's the best answer you could give, particularly if you're a kid, right? And my identity was so intertwined with this startup. And as a result, it was hard to see past this, right? And you didn't want to, the cognitive dissonance. I knew maybe earlier that this product didn't work as well as it should, and people weren't talking about that. And so this was somewhere inside of me. I knew that, but at the same time, I didn't want to articulate that. I was afraid of failure. I couldn't conceive of the next story. And I've met a lot of early stage founders who have that same problem. They can't back off from these commitments they've made to investors. They can't back off from their own trajectory, and they're suffering this perpetual cognitive dissonance that really, in walking with prestige, and I sort of called this first girlfriend problem. I don't know, we've all had a first girlfriend and boyfriend. When that relationship ends, you can't perceive of anyone else, making you that satisfied. And it's the same with this first company, particularly when it comes from your PhD and it's the only thing you've known for your whole professional life.
It's a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure. And you don't realize that you've got one life, but maybe 10 startups, right? And so once this is not going well, the best thing you can do is step away from that and work on it, and kind of apply your intelligence, whatever talent, to something new. And similarly, a bad relationship, same kind of thing. So I've seen this a bunch of times, both in some good friends and then in some early stage companies.
And the mammography you said was a class 3 PMA, which is an incredible first regulatory challenge, especially that you developed a QMS by yourself. How long did it take, by the way?
So this was 8 or 9 years, I would say.
9 years?
From initial investment to liquidation.
Oh, not 9 years to set up the QMS.
No, well, okay. I'm trying to think. Maybe it was 5 or 6 years in.
That's what he meant.
Until we had that. I think we also learned that, you're terrified. Oh, it's a QMS. They're going to come and audit you. It's actually not that hard. Once you do it once or twice, you realize that you probably know as much as the auditor. And that's the other thing. Maybe is a lot of these things we're a little intimidated by are not, really so challenging if you actually sink your teeth in.
And like I said, like you said, actually, it was a class 3 PMA. We talk about things like indications overload. What does that mean, and how could that have changed things for Z-Tech?
Yeah, well, part of the promise when you've raised $30 million, that's predicated on this $1 billion, annual revenue, $10 billion terminal valuation.
Because of this massive impact, right?
Yeah, because of the massive impact. And so if there might have been a smaller indication where the technology would have worked well. But that smaller indication might have had a more modest market, and we're a little bit stuck. But I think it's something that really, throughout, you got to kind of match what your technology can do with the right amount of burden to get there, right? So you have technology, you can do a ton of different things with it. And you want to find that sweet spot, sort of the optimum between where you can actually, afford the clinical study to get there. It's not, a $40 million clinical study, while also making enough clinical impact that you can sell it and, for some money. So I think that's the other thing I learned, was to try to early on match that, because if you're promising a really large market and you've raised money under that assumption, backing that off is really difficult. But if you plan around sort of a modest but attainable,
going the other way around, in other words,
exactly, and then move up from there.
Starting small and moving up from there.
Exactly.
Manage the expectations. I'm sure all the startup founders in the room, if we handed them a mic and asked them if they had any questions, would say, okay, that sounds reasonable, but how do we even go about making that decision of finding that sweet spot of the right clinical indication, the right clinical application, and the burden. How do you get the right information in to start making, not to make the decision, but to start even thinking about making the decision?
Yeah, I think part of it is you have to step back and recognize, so like an indication is really the difference between like a technology and a product, right? So you often, particularly now, we get a lot of our startups that are coming from, let's say a PhD thesis or tech transfer office, and really what's coming out of there is a technology, like a physical product or an algorithm. And so you have a menu of things that you can do, and that menu is often going from the least regulated, the least complex, maybe the most modern, the least defensible market, all the way down to the most regulated in terms of the claims. And we try to do is like write that menu down, like from okay, it's a wellness device, it's just reducing stress, to the next indication might be something like it helps with anxiety, which is a medical condition, to it promotes like a longer life, or it improves the activities of daily living. And so you can, in every product has this full kind of range spectrum.
And you need to be able to sell it at every step, though.
Exactly. And I think we're in a certain funding environment here, which is a constraint. There's like a regulatory constraints that sort of articulate as well, like where you can probably land with the appropriate funding environment. So but I think the first thing is even try to be a little bit agnostic to what you're doing and get that inventory, so and then you can move around between these indications as you find something out. If you bump into a wall in terms of like this becomes more difficult from a clinical data perspective, you can back off a little bit. But if you don't have that menu and you think you're doing one thing and that's the only thing you're talking about, then I think you get a little bit stuck.
Yeah, and we're often asked, and I think the question needs to be flipped, but we're asked, what's the lowest regulatory burden for us to get to market? And our answer is always, the regulatory isn't the most important consideration. The lowest margin where you should start is where there's clinical uptake and where there's a commercial viability, where there's some kind of business associated with that level, right? So when we say, should we have a lower regulatory level, our answer is always, where's the least amount of feature or indication or claim that you can get clinical adoption for, right? Like
you can get FDA approval for anything that's useful, right? Like if it works, I guarantee you, it's a matter of cost and time. And I think some people put the they do it backwards. The first thing you should do is identify what's clinically useful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then once you recognize, this is clinically useful, what's the most efficient regulatory strategy to get there? And then if that becomes prohibitive, that's when you have to say, okay, what else is clinically useful? Can we turn it down? But saying, like when people come to say, what's the most efficient regulatory path? If no one's going to buy it, or if you're really not making a clinical impact, it becomes
then
a little pointless.
It doesn't matter, right? It's academic, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and it actually leads into our next question. All of these companies are really on a shoestring at early stage especially, but any medtech startup is so fragile in terms of constantly fundraising instead of running the business, especially in Canada. So many things can kill you. Investors tend to ask two questions, and they always come back to us, but of early stage companies, what is your plan for US go-to-market, and what are you doing about the FDA? And Joel, and we should have this in common, but Joel said to me, I always ask, does it work?
Yeah, so I'm always surprised.
Are we thinking about the wrong thing?
It's sort of part of the same thing, but I think there's an assumption when investors ask me to do due diligence that the technology actually detects cancer, or I don't know, it cures stroke or something.
They take it for granted.
They take it for granted. Yeah. It's an assumption, and I think that becomes because a lot of our investors have been trained in tech. And so, like I was using this example before, but if I think about, if I have an app that knows where you are, and I have an app that knows where this driver is, and all I have to do is pair A to B,
and it's like, uber efficient.
Yeah, and it's really efficient. Exactly. Like there's no scientific, physiological, physics barrier between doing that and getting there. Like it's just work. You can program that. It might be a little less efficient. In medical technology, and I think more so even than pharma, because pharma is so prescribed, you hit walls. Like sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes you can't figure out whether it works or not without some investment. And so I think people forget that or don't want to deal with that, and they talk a lot about the specifics, like assuming it works A, B, C, and that's part of it, because to work doesn't just mean, and this is another thing that happens when you're translating from like an academic project to like a commercialization project doesn't mean like I have a p-value less than 0.05, like check, it works, or I made a publication. It means like, is it clinically useful? Does it do the thing that you're making the promise to do? And when you roll in that, then they're really asking the same question. Does it work means like, A, is it like, can it deliver clinical value? B, can we measure it in a way where we can generate evidence to support that? And if that's true, then you've sort of already answered the regulatory and reimbursement questions. They're not questions about regulatory reimbursement. That's like a framework. They're really just questions about, can we generate the appropriate evidence to substantiate that this thing works? And I think that is why, medtech's a little bit different. It's harder because you have that existential question, which doesn't exist in a lot of other technologies where it's a matter of like work and market and competition.
Yeah, and will it work at every level? Safety and efficacy is just the regulatory work, but will it work clinically? Will it work commercially? And when you said hit a barrier, when we're talking about tech, we talk about a tech barrier. This is a physiological barrier.
Yeah. Like nothing you can do can change biology, can change, there's every so often you have a great invention that like undermines it or has a, way around it. But in principle, and one of the things, when you're looking at your medical device development projects, it's, the whole process is managing risk. Like we talk about risk a lot, but like in the end, you're developing progressive certainty that this product works, whatever works means, like works, clinically useful, works, has the evidence. And what a lot of people do for the same kind of first girlfriend problem is they push away subconsciously these, like the experiments that will determine whether or not it works, like these existential experiments. They'll want to do that at the end. And there's usually a way to pull in those existential risks. And if you can design these kind of killer studies, like things that would kill your company, which is really like terrifying to do as a founder, but do those as early as possible and say, look, if this is true, I have I've increased this likelihood that the product's going to work, and pull those in versus postponing them to kind of keep the ride going. You end up really, then your company has a lot more value because your value is determined by like the probability that you're going to kind of get to the end. And if you can increase that probability early on, you're better off.
And we kind of touched on this question, but all of these important things, all of the rest on top of it, funding, building a team, getting that clinical validity. You mentioned reimbursement and clinical adoption, but commercialization is so complex in our field. When we talk about tech, we talk about product market fit. There is no demographic for medtech. The customer is a consortium of 5 or 6 completely different and complex stakeholders that all have different mandates and different needs. I often say, and this is a funny thing for me to say, but reg is not the most important thing. It's not even, it's not even top 5. Is there a most important thing?
Yeah, I'm going to be repeating myself a bit, but I think the most important thing is that the product is clinically useful. Like it has a differentiable clinical impact. And if that exists, then the worst thing that could happen is someone like snipes you and gets to that clinical impact before you. And that's not the worst way to kind of fail, right? Okay, we're trying to make people walk again. Oh, this company got there first. Like, okay, the world's better off. And, so I think still, like, generally that's the core of what's protected. And then the next thing is thinking about it as, well, how do I prove that, right? Like, it's getting, like, once you know that you have something that's truly clinically differentiable, and then it's just about developing the efficient plan to show that's in fact true, I guess.
Unmet clinical need.
Unmet clinical need.
Yeah.
Like everything else is secondary, and Mark will get you there faster, but he's not going to change the end part of it, right? Like in the end, if he gets you faster to somewhere that's not useful, what's the point?
Right. Okay. Changing gears a little bit, but back on the theme of plus ça change, our favorite topic. AI and machine learning in healthcare has taken on a life of its own. All of you and all the startups that we know at least are always being asked, what are they going to do with their massive stores of data that they're collecting? What inferences are they going to get? How are they going to turn these into new clinical insights? The computational methods we learned in first year engineering, right? I won't say how long ago, but 30 years ago. What actually has changed?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's changed is that the people developing early stage medtech companies are maybe not coming from a medtech background as much as they were before. That they're coming from AI and they have machine learning tools, and they're now moving into medtech, and that's a massive cultural shift. in terms of like what it means for things to be true, what flexibility to have and how to execute the project, and
how long does it take?
And how long does it take? What's the funding requirements, and how detailed you have to be in terms of the claims you're making, right? I think you can't really go fast and break things as much. So I think there's a lot of things that remain the same. Like even as I was saying in my first company, the things that the mistakes that were made around developing the algorithm, for example, and overfitting the algorithm and not testing it on a novel sample, like all that is really like the bread and butter of the problems that I see, in medtech now. But what's happening is as people are coming in from other industries, they tend to overpromise, be unable to like adapt to the constraints. I think that's one thing, but I'm more of the opinion that very little has changed. Like software validation is like a special process that's validated like anything else.
Representative data.
Yeah, so
training and testing. I mean, those fundamentals of AI that never change.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think has changed is these sort of common sense best practices that people were doing 15 years ago are now written down, so like FDA has a guide, there's an overall guidance on like good machine learning practices. And those aren't new, they're just articulated and I think like accessible in a way. So we're probably solidified on these best practices, but the best practices are probably there before, just like a little less accessible to people working on them.
Yeah, and even in medtech, AI-based medical devices have been regulated far back as 15 years?
Yeah, I think 20. I was looking through their, like FDA publishes this list of
every
AI best,
yeah.
And the first one is like before 2000, like 98 or something, is like an early 510K that had, now it wasn't the same deep, like the other thing that's changed is the models are better, the ability to handle bigger data, but those come with the trade-offs, right? Like the larger the model, the more you can fit and contort around the specific data, the more careful you have to be around your separating your training and validation set. But in the end, like we still have these black boxes, right? And there's some data coming in and there's some diagnosis or some, output coming out. And that's been the same for 20 years. This box is just much fancier.
Yeah, I think the implication of the inference on a clinical decision or a medical path in a treatment of a patient is a lot different. And, understanding how the model is developed and understanding how the model runs the data, there's a lot of things about AI that, we don't touch like we do other, algorithmic structures, but it's not enough to say, in our field at least, that the model is running it and the model knows because it's run the data. If it doesn't, associate to an underlying physiology, or it doesn't track with some kind of clinical activity or physiological activity that we're already aware of, it has to track, in other words, right?
Yeah, well, I think even like right now, if you have an explainable AI or an explainable algorithm, I think you're gonna go a long way in terms of providing some reassurance to whoever the customer is about how this is operating. That's quite common. And even if you can't explain all of it, you can break it down in terms of the influences. When we increase someone's body weight, this happens. And that's intuitively what you'd expect. So you can kind of articulate the topology of the space. And I think those kinds of things are not dissimilar to when we do a statistical analysis of clinical trial and say, like what's the multivariate analysis? What are the contributors to like more or less successful treatment or more or less successful diagnosis? So like the ability to explain, like one thing that is a bit new probably is, there was an LLM, the software that just got breakthrough designation, to let's say it's a talking agent to help someone. And that I think is maybe a little bit new in that it's stochastic, it's not predictable, and it's very difficult to like anticipate how it, like to put those kinds of constraints I think are probably fundamentally new, but if we applied the same principles, it would.
Has it been regulated or it's breakthrough device?
It's got a breakthrough, so it hasn't been cleared yet, but it's a breakthrough designation.
So they need to work that out.
Yeah, so that'll probably out of that, I suspect, will come like some initial first mover guidance on how you implement something like that, but it's probably going to look familiar. The way that like we're going to treat this as some kind of special process, and we're going to do a risk analysis, and we're going to identify how it could fail, and try to put some constraints around it, either through labeling or through like software that is deterministic to like manage that.
Yeah, and in this sense, probably nowhere more importantly than here, it does make sense to go incrementally through the increasing in claim and increasing in indication, especially with a little bit more unknown, right?
Yeah, well, it's with great benefit, you can tolerate great risk. But I think early on when the risk is really difficult to measure, you can kind of start with like the most modest risk indication possible, and maybe the benefit's a little bit modest, but at least it's lined up, and you can kind of bootstrap your way to kind of greater risk and greater benefit together as you're kind of increasing indications.
And it helps to manage that expectation and let investors know that that's what you plan on doing instead of shooting for the moon from day one, right?
Yeah, I think that.
I think so too.
We would have to be really careful about getting a win early on in something. Like, once there's an LLM, derived medical device that's on the market, that's like a 0 to 1 sort of indication that you can build on. But without that, and you want to sort of boil the frog slowly, right? So you want to have something that everyone agrees is kind of okay, and then move on to the next increment and the next increment. So I think like if I were their regulatory consultant, I'd try to propose something that would, like, no one would have a problem with. They think, okay, I'm really not worried about this. This is constrained. And once it's there, a little bit more, and they're like, okay, well, that increment is tolerable. And I think through that, you can probably like move the needle pretty substantially, but in these increments.
Yeah, it's always easier to evaluate risk when the device is being used clinically than it is a priori in paperwork, right? Yeah,
for sure. And I think people just don't know. And if everyone is safe, like if they're benefiting from it too, and patients are asking for it, if it's some kind of like AI psychiatry agent, and patients don't want to let go of that, or then I think people will get used to that and understand that the risks aren't quite what they used to be.
Yeah. Okay, you originally studied philosophy, you told me, which when you told me didn't surprise me, but then you switched to engineering. So 2 questions: why switch from philosophy to engineering?
Oh yeah, so.
You haven't thought about it for a while.
Well, I think so. Actually, my friend will recognize it. So I was in residence, and I was kind of. No one ever told me this is true. When I was doing my talking to your guidance counselor in high school, and I think they asked me like, what do I want to do? I said, I think I want to make like new medical things, and they said that's not a job. Like and they didn't say like, what about engineering? This is Hillcrest High School in Ottawa.
Shout out.
I'm pretty sure the guidance counselors are retired.
Do you remember their name?
No. But I sort of felt like that would be cool. But they're like, well, I don't know. Maybe you can go to medicine. I'm not sure what you do for that. So I didn't actually really, and this seems ridiculous now, but like know what engineering was. But so I was studying philosophy and sort of physiology and a few things, but like philosophy was a core. And my friend had developed, as part of his engineering design project, this bike that had attempted to drive itself. And it was constantly going down my hallway and like falling over. But it was cool. And he was always like actually physically doing something, solving problems. I was like, that's what I think that's kind of closer to what I want. And okay, so I switched eventually from philosophy to engineering. But I think it was like in the end, it was helpful to sort of start with that rigor.
Okay, this may be the first time that we've said engineering was cool, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Right? Because my kids are here. They're not listening.
Yeah, kids.
Oh, they might be listening. All right. But anyways, how is that foundation in philosophy? Was it a waste of time, or did it actually help you?
No. So I think first principles thinking in general is really important. Like what are we actually doing when we're doing engineering, regulatory affairs, and particularly regulatory affairs. So I think people it goes to this nothing's changed principle that, people think that doing regulatory is knowing the regulations off by heart, or like following the checklist,
right.
And that it's sort of it's like knowing the requirements, and it has nothing to do with that. In fact, like we used to say, people come to us if they have and they say, get us a 510K, and it's really easy, trivial. Like you don't need me if everything that went before that is true, and it's nominally impossible if everything that went before that isn't there or is missing. And I think it's because regulatory is just like an epistemological exercise, like to kind of sound a bit pretentious. But like what we're trying to do, is establish 2 truths. Like what are the benefits of a product? What are the risks of the product? And then try to develop some mechanism to compare the risks, which are often in different spaces, right? The risks and the benefits, in a way to come to some like almost ethical conclusion about whether this product, the benefits outweigh the risks. And that's not really it doesn't depend on like whether you're in the MDR, like it's under the MDR or FDA. Those are all just sort of shortcuts or like things or frameworks or like ways that we've agreed. We can get there, but the question is, like, with the 510K process, it's like this method of induction to demonstrate that you're safe and effective because this thing you're close to is safe and effective, and you do a bridging argument. And like in Europe and Canada, we're a little more first principles. We're looking at like estimating the safety, but we use things like standards, right? So we take chunks of these knowledge that we don't start from first principles, but we agree, like, is something going to electrocute you? No, not if it's 6-1 compliant. And so they're all just these like different techniques of establishing like the veracity of two claims, like the safety and the efficacy of the device. So I think that's like, I'm sure it's been articulated, but it's helpful when you're saying like negotiating with a regulator, because they're also thinking that way, like typically like a good regulator, like FDA.
A good regulator.
A good regulator, you know, is they're thinking, like, they're worried about, like, how do I know if this thing is safe? How do I know if it's effective? They're not really thinking, like, what is the exact box I need to switch here, like, in their core. And if you can engage them that way and identify, well, I think it's safe for this reason. You have concerns about this. Let's isolate to, like, a little kernel, like the one area. Like, that allows you to actually tackle that area of disagreement and get over these without talking in terms of like regulations or specifics. You can like isolate to what are we really talking about here, and like isolate that. So when we're negotiating with FDA, I think that comes out a lot, is this, like, they're trying to establish this truth of this claim, and we're trying to convince them of that. And so we're sort of walking in the same direction of trying to establish the truth of the bid.
And you have to be so rigorous about everything running a medtech company, especially early stage, but focusing on core principles and focusing on the nature of the fundamental question you're trying to answer is what I think you're saying.
Yeah, and I think it also, like, I agree. I think you have to be rigorous, but you don't always have to do everything the same way as someone else. But when you deviate from a process, if you're deviating but keeping this core like risk-benefit assessment, which, you know, why, like, so many of these regulations say you can use a risk-based approach, like it comes up all the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, so you can go to first principles and not worry so much about, like, you can deviate if it makes sense. If you have a better way to establish the benefits of product or the risks, likely that's going to be accepted. And I've never seen a case where someone said, no, like the regulation says you must do A before B. If you can establish, look, the way that we did it is just as like clear, truthful.
And by extension, if you do a good enough job and a strong enough job of that, you know, risk-benefit assessment, can you actually help a regulator overcome their fear and their risk, or actually teach them something and have them come kind of towards you and reach an agreement?
Yeah, I think really commonly that happens, like particularly towards the end of a submission. I don't know how many people have done.
That's not what most people think, by the way. So that's why I'm drilling down a little bit more on it. It is a give and take about interpretation, but always that risk benefit, right?
Exactly. I think you don't. Firstly, if FDA asks you questions and you think you disagree with them, there's like three options. One is you miss something, right? And like their assessment of the benefit of the risk is more precise than yours is.
Which is not a loss, by the way.
Yeah, no, which means like you've learned something and you need to adapt it.
Yeah.
Or they didn't understand, or they missed something. And so like you're not competitive there. What you're trying to do is just develop this common understanding. And when, you know, often you're trying to work, like the FDA is trying to work as efficiently as possible, so they're using their templates and their sort of techniques. When you get to the end of the submission, they have to make a call. That's when you can really appeal to them in this kind of risk-benefit context and try to get to that common understanding, even if, you know, before they said you can't do it this way. The reason why they said it is because they're trying to make it easier for them, you know, if you use their framework. But as you get towards the end, there's an opportunity to sort of push really onto the risk-benefit question. And
not necessarily in the submission, but in review and in discussion, not always on paper, but in an open dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think people, you know,
people are afraid of the regulators in general before they get that first experience. It's one of the things we face. So speaking to them and collaborating with them and landing on this shared understanding of the risk benefit is the right way to do it, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think their job is to tell the FDA. Like when you're in a meeting with the FDA, people spend a lot of time talking. And what you should be trying to figure out is, like what is their you should be listening, trying to figure out what their model is. Like what is it that they're like in this, like they're either worried about the risks or the benefits and why. And so you should be asking them probing questions to understand where they are, to kind of compare it to where you are, so that you can bridge that, versus constantly just speak from your perspective and say like, no, this is like, of course the sample size is fine. You're wrong. It's like, well, let's understand why you think this way. And it could be intellectual laziness, there's no question, but typically there's a reason for it. And if you know the reason, then you can undermine that reason and sort of get yourself further
It's
on.
not a court case you're presenting to the judge, right?
That's right. And they want to do they're motivated to get your product to the market. They're motivated to like do the right thing by patients. Like you have similar motivations here. It's just that you have to, they're dealing with this sort of sampling in this subset of what you're providing. They don't understand it. And so like less talking and more some probing questions to sort of establish that like that little core of thing that might switch everything, right?
Yeah. That's really insightful and counterintuitive, by the way. Okay, last question, and then we'll open it for questions from the audience. But at the top of our talk, we talked about taking a time machine from the past to the present and being able to do your job. What if you took a time machine today back to the past, knowing everything you know and all the pain and suffering and successes? Would you still choose MedTech, or would you be on a hill with a big beard?
Yeah, maybe both.
Maybe both.
There's still time. So I think, when I was looking at the end of university, and I was like, what are you going to do? So a lot of the jobs were working on some electronics that went into some infrastructure to accelerate the internet, or making an app. And like the one thing that's nice about MedTech is you don't have these sort of what I call like Jurassic Park moments. You're never trying to figure out like, should you? It's always about can you. Whereas like I think a lot of technology we're working on, probably outside of our industry, this should question is important, but MedTech is like can be ethically unambiguous. Should you allow someone to walk again? Yeah, of course you should. There's no question there. Should you, develop this new like online platform for sales? Maybe, I don't know. So that like ethical ambiguity I think is really appealing and pretty unique to like the healthcare industry in general. It's also one of the most interdisciplinary like group things you work in. So you tend to be quite narrow, like you're working on IC development for this and that. Like if you're in MedTech, you're dealing with engineering, software, kind of policy, philosophical questions, ethical questions, like, about, balancing like risk and benefit.
And clinical applications.
And and there's some benefit at the other end. So it's really, to me, like in that sense, unique. And the last one is, and I don't know if it's unique to MedTech, but the thing, when I look back, really in my consulting company, and this is going to sound really like trite, and I'm sorry, but like there's great, like the most valuable thing I came away from that whole process of having a consulting company, all these clients, is these like incredible relationships and like really unique people. And I think MedTech, because it's interdisciplinary, attracts like fascinating, kind of weird, unique, thoughtful, creative people. And I don't necessarily see that in the other industries, but I really love that and value that. When I think back, I would never want to kind of give that up in light of even, working in Silicon Valley making $1 billion.
I see it in this room in the best way possible. I think that resonates with a lot of us. It's the reason why I got into the field. I wouldn't dream of doing anything else, making video games more fun or cell phone communication more clear. There was only one option for me, and we share that. I think we share that with most people in this room. So we'll open the floor to questions. I'm sure you guys have some. Nadia, right off the top. Good stuff. Affectionately known as Matthew's mom, but also Dr. Giannetti from the MUHC.
Can you just talk a little bit about intellectual property and protecting your idea, protecting your product? How important is that?
Oh, I know what Joel's going to say.
Do you? I don't. I think you have to. Most medical device companies require some venture investment, and if you can be, overtaken by a fast follower, that medtech investment doesn't have a lot of value. So, to me, either you have some secret sauce that you're not communicating, which becomes difficult because you've got to communicate how the thing works in order to kind of commercialize it and your labeling, etc. So I think it's almost uninvestable not to have some core IP. I think people misunderstand a bit about like what a good patent is and like what kind of claim, and like if you can, you want to own the problem with IP and not the specific solution. So I think a lot of people make a patent that's like the exact invention they've developed, and then no one's going to copy, but no one's going to exactly copy that. What you want to do is have like claims that are sort of appropriately broad that you can own as much of the problem space as you can, if that's possible. It becomes harder as the space gets more crowded. But I think it's almost, unfortunately, uninvestable to have a med tech company that's based on some kind of invention insight that doesn't have a
So not the tech, again, not the tech necessarily, even though it's a patent, more about the impact of the tech.
Yeah, and this, it depends, but if you have I'm trying to think of what a good example would be, but not a specific embodiment where you have this pull wire attached to this that does this, but intravascular access to a lesion or something like that, where that's the method claim is such that it covers any particular way that you might approach that problem as broad as possible. That's where the value in IP becomes.
That's a very important question. We've been talking about everything except IP, actually. I think I hit everything except IP. Thank you, Nadia. Anybody else? Yep. Dustin, Johan's already there.
Everybody knows or everybody hears the FDA is getting harder and harder. Let's say if you look over, at least that's what I hear. And we talked about the unmet need. As medical devices are put on the market and those unmet needs are being addressed, is the FDA saying, well, why rush or make it so easy for new devices to come to the market because the market's already satisfied? We're going to up the ante because it's not that needed. And I have another question after.
So I would disagree.
I don't think it's...
FDA has gotten, I would say, easier.
Easier, yeah.
In the past few years, more reasonable. FDA, compared to all the other regulators, because they have to meet their timelines and they have their funding is dependent on them meeting certain performance criteria. They're the most user-friendly of any regulator. So I don't think FDA has gotten harder. I think they've gotten more rational and provided more tools to help with. I sincerely do. And I don't think, Europe has maybe gone, if you ask me that question about Europe, I would say for sure that the regulatory environment in Europe has gotten
more difficult.
Yeah, much worse, much less predictable. It used to be that you had an early stage company, you go to Europe first. Big market, relatively low bar, and then you go to FDA because FDA was a high bar. And there's some very few examples where I would recommend going to Europe first. But I don't think Europe's doing that to slow down innovation. I think Europe's doing it because of a risk aversion.
Managing risk.
And an obsession that process can manage risk in a way that I think more so than it probably can.
Is extreme in that case. I think one of the things about the FDA is that their mandate is to commercialize. The other regulators' mandates are to manage risk. It's a little bit of a different, even though it's always risk-based, it's a bit of a paradigm shift with the Americans. Their mandate is to commercialize new technology. So I'm not sure we see that. We see more technology being regulated more quickly. What's part two? Should we move to Europe?
No, I've been staring at that logo, Mark, for years, the BML Health logo. Could you explain the wiggles?
Dustin, I've never been asked in front of 100 people to explain the wiggles. I guess we could take it offline or not. I guess I have to answer now. All right. Actually, it was not. It was very intentional, and it was done by a brilliant designer who had never worked with medical before, but they were really familiar with tech, and we really gave them kind of the DNA of what we do. And I thought that was a really great experience. Instead of saying we like this color, or we like these shapes, we said this is what we do. And honestly, we had 1 hour, a single hour meeting, and they came back with 3 logos, and this one stood out. And when I said to him, "Okay, what is this?" He said, "Well, first of all, it's a sine wave. And that's very scientific and very mathematical. Second of all, it's two sine waves that are out of phase. And they're kind of chosen in a way that they look a bit like a B and they look a bit like an M. And I thought, okay, now he's just trying to sell it, you know? And he said, and I think what you guys do is you take signals that are out of sync and help clients put them in sync. And I went, okay, well, we'll take that one. And it's an interesting question. I wasn't expecting to answer something about our logo, but we're very fond of it. So thanks, Dustin. Appreciate it. Matt, over here, Johan.
I really found your discussion about the US and Europe very interesting because I have clients all the time that are pondering expansion into the US. What's the latest? Did Trump gut the FDA? Is this going to take me forever? Is it a time thing? Should I be thinking about Europe? If we take the US out, can you think of another jurisdiction? Southeast Asia, somewhere, South Africa, Europe, where would you go to if someone absolutely was like, I'm going to go somewhere else to get my approval, where would you say?
That's not the US.
Exactly.
Well, I think, there are a few industrialized markets, really. There's the US, there's Europe. I think there's a play with Canada that we shouldn't deny, which is that, so the UK will be accepting Health Canada licenses.
And just to be clear, that's no longer the European Union, so it's not CE anymore.
So it's separate.
It's MHRA in the UK.
And Switzerland is also doing that. And then there are other countries, that accept country of origin approval, and that provides a fast track. So,
just to clarify, which means if you have clearance or approval or a license in Canada, then your license in the other country is much faster.
And similarly, there's some that will inherit like UK approval, and so
some require it too.
I don't know, but yeah. I think that Canada is not a difficult regulator from a scientific perspective to get clearance. There's some, Canada has this MDSAP requirement. You need this special kind of audit for your quality system, which is incremental, and really Canada's one of the only modern markets that really needs this. But that's just work, right? So you can hire a consultant and you work on that, you can get this. There's no risk associated with that. And the amount of clinical data that Health Canada would typically require is substantially less than would be necessary in Europe, and for some products less than we need in the US. So what I think the play would be, if you remove the US, would be get Canadian approval, get access to the UK market, get access to the Swiss market, look for what other markets, there's South Korea, a few other secondary ones. Also, in the Middle East, Saudi's a big market. I think you get fast-tracked with Health Canada. And use Health Canada as a sort of stepping stone to these secondary markets that are much larger than Canada. So you have Canada, the UK, Switzerland, Saudi. That starts to look, it's not the same size as the US market, but it's not a bad market. And that's what I'd probably do as an alternative.
Thank you for that. That's really useful information because Canada's definitely our brand has improved, and our friendship with Europe and with the UK and that, and so you see a trajectory upwards of, and our in MedTech being acceptable in these areas, and the Canadian passing through the regulatory in Canada opens doors into these other jurisdictions. You see that as a great step.
Yeah, I think it's a possibility. I think on its own, the Canadian market as a first market is maybe too small, and for reimbursement and other reasons, it may not be your preferable only market. But if you tack on a few other markets with it that sort of come for free or at modest incremental cost, I think it's there. And Health Canada still has some international, a reasonable international reputation. I don't think people are thinking, we're getting these adulterated medical devices from Canada. That's not Canada's brand internationally. So, I do, you're not going to get undermined your credibility if you were to say go to some other jurisdiction which has a lower bar.
And you also de facto have to have the MDSAP, so you tie into those countries right away. But keep in mind, Matt, going to market is not just about the regulatory.
There's different language, different culture, different business culture, proximity. So it's very difficult to market internationally much further beyond the reg. Anybody else? Jeff. Oh, Phil.
Hey, Mark. Phil Thompson from the CTS. We spoke extensively about regulatory, product development, milestones, and you mentioned the unmet clinical need. Just curious to get your views on how you reconcile all that with commercialization strategy, your experiences and your views, really. I'm just curious how you package it all in to make a commercial success out of all this.
Well, I still think the unmet clinical need is, well, maybe it's table stakes, but it's necessary. And the stronger that pull, the easier everything else gets. I think there are secondary questions around like market access and reimbursement if there's existing billing codes and those kinds of things which really accelerate. But you don't want an undifferentiated product. Like, it's harder to sell an undifferentiated product. I think one of the biggest mistakes companies make is underestimating the effort. It's not like there's going to be a market there when you're done this process. And even if you have the best commercialization strategy, the amount you have to invest to build out a sales and marketing team to detail this, to develop a new indication to make a market is, multiples of what you need to bring that product to market. So I think you have to get to the market. You have to get a product to the market that people need. Ideally one that, has some ability to get reimbursed. But then there's no shortcut, unfortunately, to that second step of investing, tens of millions of dollars to actually drive sales. No one's standing on the other side just desperately waiting for your product.
There has to be a pull from the clinical field, right?
There has to be a pull from, but there has to be an investment. And this is one of the things Canadians do really badly, I think, in general, is we don't have the sales and marketing operators who know how to, set up a proper, incentivize the sales force, set them up, detail them, have reps in the ORs, all these things. Canadians are sometimes a little skeptical of making money, on things and sitting in the OR and selling. And you may want to really, if the U.S. is your first market, is pull in people who've built markets in the U.S. who know exactly, who know these call points already, and that's going to be expensive. But if you don't, you need to spend millions of dollars on this. If you don't, you're going to end up in a lot of the, and I can mostly speak to sort of Toronto-based companies, but there are 3 or 4 publicly traded Toronto-based companies whose revenue has been sitting under $1 million for years, just desperately low. And it's because that commercialization, that truly investing, detailing that out, was just not contemplated in the beginning when they were setting these things out. And the ones that have broken through have had those strategic partnerships, those networks, and built out a proper sales force with people who've done it before, and accelerated by knowing their call points to kind of get there. And it still takes years, but
and I was going to say, in terms of time, order of magnitude.
Years. I think you're looking at 5 years, probably from clearance to 8 to really, see that, to start getting enough, cash positive, enough revenue. They're going to be, acquired based on some multiple of EBITDA instead of some promise along the way, which is why, we end up selling in Canada. So we're not great at that secondary commercialization piece. So we sell to someone who can plug into their existing commercialization infrastructure network. They already have that sales force.
And it needs to start early. Reimbursement needs to start early. Sales and marketing planning needs to start early, and regulatory approval has to be in the process. And if you think that the regulatory approval, and we see it on Gantt charts, on pitch decks all the time, see FDA pre-sub, clinical data, FDA clearance, market. And the reality is that it's on the order of 5 to 8 years.
Yeah, if you want to look at a credible business plan after that point, or it's how many reps, what geographies, why those geographies, what call points, can we concentrate our marketing? Is it an easy to detail? Is there some subset of practitioners who are really being driven by this because, they're in a private MR suite that does this percentage of whatever. And you can isolate these, and they're concentrated in New England, and so you can have them detailed. It's those kinds of questions that need to be resolved.
You've written about this, Joel, bottom up sales plans instead of top down, right?
Yeah.
TAM of 34 billion.
Yeah.
We'd rather talk about the number of operating rooms in a region that would adopt based on the price point and multiply that out bottom up, right?
Yeah.
I like that better, obviously, for so many reasons. But it's labor intensive and it requires very specific knowledge, right? So how do you do that without that workforce that has already been in the field? Like you, Phil. You've already been in the field, you know that, right? Great question. Anybody else? Jeff. Dustin, by the way, also a great logo if you want to get the story from Jeff later.
Yeah, the same logo maker?
No.
No, I don't think so.
You'll see the name badge after. It's great.
Yeah, Jeff Graham from Nose. You kind of touched on my question a little bit there, but I'm wondering sort of what are the problems to be solved, to build mature medtech companies in Canada? Is it an investment problem? Is it a mindset problem? You mentioned kind of a marketing and commercialization problem, but are there other things you'd highlight?
Well, there are some successful medtech companies in Canada. They tend to generally be small stories or get acquired. I think they're kind of in the park, ground rule double. I think we shouldn't be afraid of those kinds of companies as well. Like I think these little stories kind of beget big stories, and we're always chasing like the unicorn, and I think sometimes that unicorn just doesn't manifest as much as the early stage risk managed companies in some ways. But there's a ton we can do, I think, by so I have a bias on this. I think that we focus a lot on incubating kind of IP-driven early-stage companies, and we don't recognize companies like BML. And this isn't a plug; it is my bias, and the glue around it. So if you look in like Medtronic or around Minnesota, right, Minneapolis, like that's a ecosystem that's built with a ton of service providers, a ton of people who are moving back and forth, sales, marketing, etc. And each one of these layers is really like well-respected, integrated, and it creates an engine that you can pull from. And I think in Canada, we tend to focus a little bit on like the entrepreneur who has this great idea, and we get them a little bit of funding, but we don't respect kind of the holes that are around them in terms of like a sales and marketing, person and an operator and building or even consulting or service providers that can like fill those gaps, and not even focus so much on, is this a Canadian person? Like, is this a service provider? Is this IP? But really think about, how do we get the best international talent on that side to support it? So like, what I would do, you want to commercialize Canadian IP, right now we recognize that there's a limited number of Canadian commercialization experts. Like, establish some great startup, like visa program, not for startups, not for tech people, but for people who've like grown out sales and market, like these holes that Canada's really great at. Bring them in. Some people are tired of being in the States. There is a lineup of some people I think who want to change their environment. And if they build out a sales market, bring them in and like help them support these companies, and respect operators versus people who sort of pretend to like have done that before but haven't really grown a sales force.
I was going to say dollars versus talent, or both.
Like, you need the dollars. There's no question. But I think if you're pulling talent from markets that have dollars, I think the dollars will come with them. Like if you bring in someone who's grown, a business to $1 billion, like truly grown that, and they're coming in and they're operating, they're going to have credibility with the investors they work with before they'll have access to them. So not being afraid of bringing in this talent who's really done this before to bootstrap that next generation of Canadian medical device companies, and also highlight the success of the Canadian medical device companies we have, even if they've exited, and incentivize them to kind of maintain their sales.
Okay. But isn't that also a mindset thing where about going big, bringing in the right talent, really going for it versus, trying to bootstrap it and sort of work with what you have?
Yeah, like I think there's probably a space for both. I think we need to fill up the whole range of like different tech. But even if you have a bootstrapped company that's sort of there, and you're on the market, I think you still probably want to have that exceptional sales and marketing like talent that you don't otherwise have. I think it's really a shift from a focus on like where, and I'm an engineer. Like I wish it was engineering that drove the success, but
It is very.
it really is. It's like the sales and marketing and the network, knowing, as someone who knows who to call at the hospital who's making that buying decision, who knows how to manipulate that process, that's going to be the difference between success and failure, and prevent all these orphan companies who are just like dying on fumes or whatever, or getting kind of taking out really low valuations. So, I think that talent will make a huge difference.
Jeff, have you met Phil? You should speak to Phil as well before you leave. Yeah. One last question? Okay, that was the last question. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to Joel, of course. Again, thank you to our sponsors, BDO, Rich and Mad. Thank you to CTS Santé, Startup à Résidence, City of Montreal, Parc Jean Drapeau, who was great. Our team at BML, the whole team is here. Johan and Gleb on marketing and video and everything that you see here. If you did enjoy it, it was Tara's idea. She doesn't want any credit. She worked her butt off to make this happen very, very quickly. Please thank her when you see her. And thank you again, everybody. Merci. Bonne soirée.